All right. I want to talk about I guess I would call it the economics of sports or the uh, motivations, the revenue drivers within sports, and what motivates particularly franchises and organizations to make the decisions that they do. Because I think that for the most part, everybody tends to assume that the whole purpose of having a professional sports team is to win games. And I do think, to a certain extent, for the players, for the coaches, generally speaking, that is their goal. Um, in any given league, there's only one champion at the end of the year, so not everybody expects to win every single game. But for the most part, the goal is win as much as you can. And I think to a fan, you would like to think that that's how the whole organization operates, that it's all about just winning a bunch of games. And that's what fans want to go and see, is their team win. That's why they're fans and that's what they're cheering for. But the reality is, I don't think that's really how team owners, in particular, and front offices actually operate. At the end of the day, it's a business. It's a numbers game, and it's about generating revenue, bringing money into the organization. And one way to generate revenue is by selling tickets. And you certainly can make the case that the better your team performs, the more tickets you're going to sell. And so that stands to reason that that would be a pretty good motivation to win games, or to at least put yourself in a position to be more likely to win games, put better players on your roster, hire better coaches. All of those things are true. But that's not the only source of revenue that teams get. They can sell licensing and merchandise and apparel and all of the things that the fans want. I am not a particularly big professional sports fan, but I am a big fan of Ohio State, particularly football, but other sports as well. And my house is full of Ohio State coffee mugs and tumblers and T-shirts and flags and posters and decorations and coasters and all of the things that you could possibly imagine that one could print the logo of a team onto. I probably own it. A pillow, a blanket. It all exists, and it all somehow manages to exist in my house. To be fair, most of those are gifts from kids, because that's what kids do for their dads, is they buy them things with their favorite team logo all over it, which is fine with me. But I think if you're a professional franchise owner, and I'm going to use Cincinnati as an example because that's where I am. We have two really interesting examples here in the Bengals and the Reds, who are obviously the NFL is more evenly spread market sharing structure, whereas baseball is not, and Cincinnati is a small market, so the Reds don't have a ton of money to spend, and they try to do the best they can with a roster full of players who are willing to get paid less or are younger and haven't been moved on to veteran contracts yet. And the reason I mentioned the Reds, because I don't really know much about baseball and how the economics work. Obviously, you have a draft, but there's many rounds, and players spend a lot of time in minor leagues before they make it to the majors, and you're paying those players, and there's a whole farm system that you have to support. And you have lots and lots of games. So in smaller markets, you're not going to sell out every game. But it is interesting that, like, the Reds made a playoff push this year and actually managed to squeak in, mostly because the Mets failed more so than the Reds succeeding. But late in the season, when it was close, they did have some really important games that they had to win, and some of those games were at home. And that was as full as you will probably ever see Great American Ballpark, unless they actually have a home playoff game at some point in the future, or on opening day, which is a big deal in Cincinnati. But for the most part, that's all it takes. One playoff run every 10, 20 years, and everybody will come back in a place like this. And I think that's important to remember when you think about particularly the Bengals, which is, I think, broadly considered one of the more poorly run professional organizations. And I'm going to come back to this in a minute, but it reminds me of something that's kind of unrelated, but I think what we do as fans, and we do this as people in general, but, I'm talking about sports fans in particular here, is that we assume kind of the motivation. And so we assume everybody in the organization wants to win, just like we want them to win. That's the goal. That's the purpose. That's why you exist, is to go win games. And so we think that's what the organization wants. But I think as much as that may be true, there are other motivations. I've already said that. I don't want to repeat myself too much. But the example that I'm thinking of where like we really think we understand people's motivations and we don't is I also think it's interesting the way we talk about late night comedy, particularly people that tend to be on the conservative side of the aisle who don't like late night comedians for being very left wing and in a lot of cases pretty negative towards anybody or anything that even leans to the right. But the complaint that you always hear is that late night comedy is not funny anymore, that Jimmy Kimmel and Jimmy Fallon and Stephen Colbert and Seth Meyers and whoever else is still on late night, they just aren't funny. And the thing is, they just don't have to be funny. The motivations and the economics of late night TV are not based on trying to draw viewers to the host because of how funny they are. There was a time when late night TV started and when late night TV was very popular. I'm too young to really remember Johnny Carson being live, but I know he is somebody that frequently gets referenced, but I do certainly remember growing up with David Letterman and Jay Leno on TV, and they were considered funny and people watched because they thought those guys were funny, and you never really knew what was going to happen in an interview, and they didn't always kind of bend over backward to make the celebrity that they were interviewing feel great. Sometimes the celebrity they were interviewing was the butt of a joke. And that was okay because the whole purpose was to get people to watch this comedian who's hosting a show, and then the guests would use that audience that comedian brought to themselves to talk about their project, their movie, their TV show, their book, their interesting story that they want to draw attention to. And so they needed that audience. Well, the whole thing has shifted. The whole thing has changed. Now everybody has their own audience. They have their social media accounts and they're publicly, they're very visible and can be easily followed and watched, and people can know what they're going on or know what's going on in their lives. They don't need to be on a late night show for somebody to hear their opinion on something or to be entertained by some, story that happened in their life recently or their experience on set with another famous person or whatever the things that people used to be interested in tuning into late night to watch beyond just the comedy. None of that is the case. Now, the host is getting their views from how popular the guests are and how many followers they already have. And so there's no real motivation or there's no, negative outcome that they're going to experience by not being funny. That's not the point. They're not trying to draw a crowd by being funny anymore. And I think as much as we just I don't know, don't seem to get that through our heads. We don't seem to understand that the world doesn't work the way it used to, or the way we want it to, maybe, or the way we think it still should. We got to update our thinking and recognize that there's different things going on. And I think the same is true in sports. And I think the same is true particularly here in Cincinnati. Like I mentioned, the Reds only needed to have one playoff push and people were willing to pay for a ticket again. The competition for a sports team is not other sports teams. It's people's attention. It's, are people going to pay for a ticket to show up to a game, or are they going to pay for their favorite player's jersey or whatever else it is? Or are they going to spend that time and money on something else? And so, yes, you would like to put a good product on the field to get their time. But if you can't get their time, you can get their money through your jerseys or through whatever other merchandise you can sell or deals you can strike. And so a perfect example, you look at the Bengals right now, they're in a terrible position. They just lost their third game in a row after winning their first two games of the season, which they haven't done since their head coach, Zach Taylor, got to town. And they had their quarterback get hurt, and they're on this 3-game losing skid because they had a backup who wasn't very good, and the backup is lucky he's still alive and around, given that he is playing behind the offensive line that this Bengals leadership has put together, and therein ultimately, I think, lies the problem. Because the Bengals could have invested, particularly this past offseason, in a better offensive line. There's a good chance their quarterback wouldn't be hurt right now, that Joe Burrow would still be okay if he had some real protection. And the Bengals chose instead to invest in multiple top-end receivers. And being top-end receivers means they have to be paid like top-end receivers. And I think the front office made the calculation that, look, we can make it our goal to go win games and go find some of the pieces that are missing on our, particularly our offensive line. But, the defense isn't especially impressive either. So maybe we should make some improvements there. Or we can set those things aside, or worry about those things later. Hopefully our good players can overcome that. And at least if we can get these good wide receivers and our defensive end signed to contracts for another year, that's another year of jerseys we can sell, because nobody's buying an offensive lineman's jersey. Nobody's going to the store to pay for the jersey of the left tackle. It just doesn't happen. And so the star power that you're after is these big name wide receivers and skilled positions. And that's what's going to bring in the money. And even if you lose games, you still have those sales to hang your hat on. And at the end of the day, it's a business. They're trying to make money, not just win games, as much as people would like to think that's their goal. So I think they're still accomplishing what they want. They're still selling those T. Higgins and those Trey Hendrickson and those Jamar Chase jerseys while they lose every game. And if that's what they're trying to do, is just make money, I think they're perfectly okay with that. And it's probably going to stay that way for a long time. And I think fans should just get used to it.